Well, so now we are reaching the end of the day, and the last presentation will be by Richard Stedman, who is a professor in policy and resources management at the Cornell University in the United States, and he will provide a particular view from the agency, with the title Sense of Place and Agency in Sustainability Transitions. Richard, great. Welcome.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you very much for having me and inviting me to speak at your lab yesterday. So for those of you who were in that talk yesterday, I'll try to give an abbreviated version of what I did then. So I think the integration of time and space is really important, and so many of the projects here are dealing with time. So much of what I do deals with space. It was Doreen Massey, I think, who wrote every place is also a time, and I'm thinking now that time is going to manifest very differently in different contexts and different places, and so I think thinking about that interaction is very important. If you'll forgive me, just a brief advertisement. We have a job opening at Cornell it's an environmental sociology position in the Department of Development Sociology. So for any of you who are supervising graduate students who are finishing or people who are interested in that, please come see me. It's a good job. I'm on the search committee. Anyway, okay, so I'll set that aside. So I think I'm part sociologist and part social psychologist and part psychologist, and I study place. And so there are people who say, well, Rich, it's actually very simple. What you really are is a geographer. So I don't know if that's true, but I think the interface of sociology and psychology is extraordinarily interesting in terms of how our actions and our agent-based actions are affected by context, and how in turn we reshape that context through our actions. And so what I want to talk about are some, saying it as issues is probably too strong, but some discussions I've had with Nikki and with others about the transitions work in particular that I think is thankfully really at least beginning to engage questions of agency. And Adina, I was so happy with your presentation today. I mean, it's so lovely to see the level of emphasis that agency is being put in this gathering in particular. So we've talked about a couple of things already that I wanted to talk about. This question of agency potentially being positive or negative, the question that I raised earlier about agency potentially being change averse, not only change seeking. There's another point that I want to make about the study of, and forgive me, I'll do some lumping between like the resilience work, which I'm actually more familiar with, resilience, transitions, transformations. All of these perspectives, I think, in general, share a commonality in that they believe that these systems that they're studying are ontologically real. They think that at some level they have characteristic processes and components that stand apart from our perceptions of them as individual actors and as collectivities. And I want to take that on a little bit from the perspective of agency. And so essentially, I'd like to make the point that these system changes are based on our perceptions and our associated behaviors. And so it's our perceptions of these systems that help to create, impede, recreate these transitions themselves. And I use sense of place theory to interrogate this. Just as a note, on that sense, so the systems that I'm talking about are places. I'm very interested in communities, whether small communities, urban centers, and what's really interesting and really tricky about studying place-based systems is they're a crucible, they're a nexus for all of these different systems coming together, right? So I mean, a city or a small town is not simply a food system or an energy system or an employment system or an educational system or whatever type of system you'd want to talk about. It's all of these things simultaneously. And so when you tug on one of them and you say, oh, we're going to make changes to the food system, well, there are other elements that come right along. And so, so one of the biggest points then that I want to make is about subjectivity and subjective agency. And it was Max Weber who said that to properly know and understand social action, we must study the subjective meanings that motivate that action for the individuals who carry it out. And I would extend that to groups as well. So, short version of it, we don't just take in stimuli passively, we behave according to the interpretations that we give to things. And so when we encounter a setting, we don't take in all of the data just as it is. We don't take a photograph of it. We don't take a recording of it. We select certain things that we pay more attention to. And so there are differences in terms of what we perceive and how it is that we interpret those perceptions. And I think to tie this to the transition literature, the kinds of things that we look to as evidence that a system has transitioned, is accelerating. So I thought the point that was just made about, that we just sort of go on our business and cars are going by, and are we transitioning or not? So what it is that we look to, how we interpret what we see and what constitutes evidence, I think is really important to think about. And so there's second big point I want to make is that there's an incredible amount of variability here across multiple domains. And so just a few that I've listed. What do we think the system is? To talk about a community or place, what kind of a place is it? I'll come back to that in a minute. What do we want the system to be? Because systems have lots of moving parts, what phenomena do we pay attention to? What meaning is attributed to what we pay attention to? And so all of these things I've alluded to. Another one is even variability in our levels of agency or capacity for action, right? I mean, so there may be a number of us who have different visions of what we would like a system to transition from to. If those differences co-vary with differences in levels of agency, wherever they come from, we can make some predictions about what direction things are likely to take. And so, underlying all of this is the role of power, right? In terms of disproportionate influence, right? This idea of human agency is distributed unequally. Some people's meanings potentially matter more than others, depending on where we sit, either relative to what's considered normal or where we sit relative to our capacity to engage in decision making. And so we need to take this into account. And so one of the points that I'm trying to make, there's been a lot of talk already about, we need to understand differences across contexts to see how these things play out. We need to understand variability within contexts as well. So it's really sort of an analysis of a variance problem. So in terms of sense of place theory, which is where I do a lot of my work, I see this as a way of engaging this subjectivity. And just a brief primer on sense of place. If people are more interested, there's tons of stuff I can point you to. But this idea, again, sort of betraying my geography roots, this idea of sense of place really being this moment of encounter between the social and the ecological. So it's really it's a coupling mechanism. It's a subjective interpretation of what's present in the landscape. I've alluded to this point already. We're active interpreters. We don't just take in stimuli passively, but we interpret it, we process it, and we behave accordingly. We're framers, we're storytellers, we're account developers in that sense. And so just a couple of core constructs within the literature that we stumble across a lot. We read a lot about attachment. So attachment being the idea of the strength of the connection you perceive between yourself and a place. And so what's really interesting is a lot of the early sense of place writers, Tuan, probably the pioneer in this, are talking about the meaning and attachment that people have for a spatial setting. Everyone stampeded away to start measuring levels of attachment, and nobody was really paying enough attention to meanings. And so I think meanings are really a very, very important construct that have been underthought about and under empiricized. So that's attachment. Some people talk about some different domains within attachment, the idea of place dependence being the idea of a place serving instrumental functions. How well does it facilitate goal achievement? Very classic psychology. Another being place identity, which is a more symbolic connection that people perceive between themselves and a setting. And the thing that I find interesting is there's only so much of a relationship between these. So it's the places that do well at serving our goals are not necessarily the places that we symbolically feel ourselves to be attached to. Each of these domains of attachment stands apart from meanings when we can think of meanings in a couple of different ways. I mean, one simply being a series of adjectives or descriptors. You know, what kind of a place is A Coruña? What kind of a place is Ithaca, New York? What kind of a place is, you know, Europe? So it's scalable from the very, very small to the very, very large. So we can think about meanings as being these descriptors of place. We can also think about meanings as taking on a little bit more of a symbolic role. What does a place mean? What does it signify? Does it mean home? Does it mean escape? Does it mean capture? Does it mean drudgery? Does it mean freedom? So we can think of these sorts of meanings that we attribute to place. And so it's really important from the standpoint of understanding behavior that we engage both attachment and meanings, and I'll come back to that in a second. But one of the really important points in this is that a given place will embody multiple sets of meanings. There will be different actors that hold different meanings for that setting. And so one of the mistakes that I think that we sometimes make is we think, well, if we can promote attachment to place, it means people will get along. It means people will be similarly committed to moving a place forward and taking stewardship-based action or whatever kind of action that we feel like is appropriate. As long as people are attached, then they'll do the right thing. And that's wrong. And it's wrong because we're potentially attached to a place as a very different kind of place. If you and I are both strongly attached to Edinburgh, I just pulled that out of thin air, but you think Edinburgh ought to go this way, and I think Edinburgh ought to go another way, we're not going to get along. We're going to wind up arguing with each other. And so from the standpoint of understanding behavior, this idea is really important. It's not simply that we engage in or fight for places that we're attached to, but we fight for places that we're attached to where the meanings that we hold dear for these kinds of places are threatened by particular kinds of change. And so this comes back to the point that I made earlier about, and I think the sense of place framework is quite powerful. One thing that troubles me a lot about it is, in some ways, it's sort of the inverse of transitions work, which I think often is very change-oriented. Sense of place work in general tends to be quite conservative, not politically conservative necessarily, but conservative in the sense of change-averse. There's a very, very strong undercurrent to this form of work about keeping things the same and about claims and about boundary making and saying this doesn't fit or that doesn't fit. And you see that even with dialogues about elements like immigration, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's what we're experiencing here now in Europe. So certain types of practices don't fit. Certain types of people don't fit. Certain types of land uses potentially don't fit. And so there's a very strong conservative element. I have another. One more acronym coming from your list before that you may or may not know, which is CAVE. Do you know CAVE? So CAVE is Citizens Against Virtually Everything, and so from the standpoint of being change averse, I think. We potentially see these kinds of things a bit. I want to conclude just by making a couple of comments on how it is that we understand sense of place. I mean, part of the problem, and I think part of the reason that questions about agency and subjectivity haven't been better engaged, is people often mistake, at least from my standpoint, mistake the idea of all of this variation with the idea that it's ad hoc and random variation. I don't think it needs to be ad hoc and random variation. I think there are systematic patterns in the way that different groups of people, by virtue of their position in society or what have you, experience different kinds of places. places. And so it's not simply that we have to be completely random about this. And so just a couple of words about sort of the sense of place theory and where it's come from. This idea of a phenomenological sense of place, that one person's experience and attachment is not reducible to sets of variables because it's completely different from everyone else's, right? My view of A Coruña is mine alone, and it's not really comparable in the way that we tend to do conventional science. That's sort of the dominant view of sense of place theory. A lot of my work has challenged that and has tried to look at how it is that we can compare across groups, how it is that we can compare across different settings, how we can compare within a setting from time 1 to time 2 to time 3. There are pros and cons of each of those. I mean, there are some very strong elements about doing phenomenological in-depth work, and there's some very strong elements about more of the cause and effect conventional science mode as well. I do think that more of the conventional science view in some ways is potentially more easily integratable to studies of resilience and studies of transition than the more phenomenological approach has been. So I'll stop there. Thanks. I wanted to go long enough to hear the tambourine because I like that.
Thank you very much, Richard. So it's time for some questions or some reflections.
Yeah.
Yes?
The microphone?
And after you, Alex.
Yeah.
Do you want the microphone?
Okay, then thanks for that. Yes. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is community as a concept, as an idea. And when you were talking about that, I kept thinking, okay, so a lot of times we can substitute community symbolically with identity, with all sorts of themes that you were talking about. So, yeah, I just wanted to kind of make that comment and put it out there. I don't think it's a question, really.
Well, I'll answer it anyway. I mean, and it's funny you should ask, because this semester I'm teaching a PhD class called Place, Community, and Environment, where we basically put place and community up against each other and look at some of the commonalities and some of the contrasts. And you're right, they have an awful lot in common. I think one of the things that I find quite different is you can develop a strong attachment to place without it being particularly socially based. I mean, obviously you can develop social attachments, and for a lot of people they can be huge elements of place. But I call it the hermit on the hill phenomenon too. I mean, that you can be ferociously attached to a landscape and the physical environment of that landscape and not care too much about the people. Whereas I think community really requires an element of social interaction to it. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that more.
Some more questions, Alex?
Hi. I liked your presentation. And I kind of agree that concept of agency needs to be brought into the transition theory that we're discussing here over these 2 days more. But I also have some concerns. And this is a difficult point to make, but I think that what we need is a way forward that involves an ontological plurality. So to try to explain what I mean, in our project, the Transit Project, we have social psychologists, so we have people like Adina and Flor that are working very much on bringing a concept of agency and empowerment into our theory building. We also have social practice theorists. Mm-hmm. Now, it's always fun when you get social practice theorists in a room with social psychologists. So this room seems to be more the social psychologists rather than social practice theorists. Personally, I'm not a social practice theorist, but I'm kind of see a role for both. And if you zoom out to the current literature in transitions, my assessment of it is that you're seeing new developments that are trying to bring social practice theory into transition studies, as well as many developments that are trying to bring psychology theories and social psychology more into transition studies. And I feel that there's a role for both. So I feel that there is a danger and a trap to get into of focusing only on trying to bring agency into a concept of transitions. I think if I I try to speak from how I understand social practice theory and what I think a social practice theorist would say if they were here in the room right now. They wouldn't actually disagree with what you said in your presentation, but they would more question the extent to which people really exhibit agency when they get up in the morning and put the kettle on and put a load of washing into the washing machine, etc., get into their car, drive to work, and go through the everyday routinized practices which produce the carbon emissions and other environmental impacts that we're so concerned about. So my hunch is that a more mature version of transition theory will pay due attention to the role of agency in instigating and accelerating and driving sustainability transitions, but also the way in which a sustainability transition is about going from one embedded, ingrained, routinized set of everyday practices to another. And sometimes it might involve a process of shifting to a different practice, or sometimes it might accept the reality of an ingrained practice and just find a way of making that less impactful in terms of the environment. And that may be what the civil society initiative can do. So that points to a way that what we need is within a particular research project, within a particular piece of research, to be able to use different ontologies simultaneously. That requires a sort of sophisticated sort of theoretical framing, but it also has the added bonus of making it easier, I think, to acknowledge that every single actor that we look at will also have a different ontological framing about the world.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very smart comment, and I agree. I mean, I think I'm certainly not trying to suggest that it's all agency. I mean, routinized behavior is incredible and it's structured, right? And so we also need to understand the structures that help to produce routinized behavior and to make certain modes much easier to engage in than other modes. I like the idea of agency, as whether we want to
call it as part of the acceleration phase, if we want to use that language or not, as helping to sort of usher in these new sets of routinized practices. So I certainly don't see it as an either or, but I like your comment quite a lot. Yeah.
I have a question of understanding. I was very intrigued by the comment on community and space, and I wonder how the idea of virtual space fits in, because it seems to transcend at least the geographic space and sometimes even time.
Yeah.
And it's certainly very important to what's happening in transitions and certainly forming ontologies. So how does that fit in?
Very difficultly. No, I mean, that's something that the sense of place theorists and the community theorists really, really wrestle with the idea. I mean, that's one of the original sort of foundational elements underlying both areas of inquiry, is that they have a real grounded map coordinate location to them. And there are some very, very strong voices that say, no, they don't necessarily need to. And I tend to agree with that point, but I think the practices then potentially obviously can play out in very, very different ways. And I mean, I think, even from the standpoint of social learning, the idea that one's learning and one's behavior is formed in response to one particular setting and the experiential perspective that they've had with that setting, well, that's obviously nonsense, right? You distill things that you have learned from being in other places and you bring them to a place. You distill things. I'm a member of a number of, virtual communities, a couple of which are still place-based. I'm friends of XYZ group that has that I'm not there, and the other people who are part of this group aren't there, but we all care about. So it becomes, the complexity of what I've talked about. You take virtual place and space and community, and you overlay that, and we've compounded it. So I think the processes potentially can differ quite significantly, and I think the resulting behaviors can as well. But certainly, I think those kinds of questions from the standpoint of not being parochial in terms of our discussions of place become very important, because I think there's that real possibility of being too parochial, too place-based, and not necessarily seeing the connections between that particular spot on the globe and everything else that it really is tied to. Yeah.
Yes, Domenico.
Is your concept of attachment, which I'm not used to learn to hear about attachment in this context, more in the ICT we use it more. Can we imagine that it's close to what Goethe was speaking about, elective affinity, where you have something which is not rational, without rationality, you put two people which normally should have a good chemistry, and it's awful. And Goethe used the term elective affinity. Is attachment a little bit related to that, or not at all?
I think it is related to that, and I think sort of the apparent illogic of attachment relates to that as well. I mean, one of the areas that I've pursued in this line of work is looking at the relationship between what we might think of as like place attributes, like whether it's environmental quality, like water quality or forest health, or community quality, like crime rates or unemployment rates or educational attainment. I sort of foolishly went into the work assuming that, well, people will be attached to better, by these sort of arm's length indicators, these better kinds of places. And it's not true. We have an amazing capacity through accumulated experience, through memory, through selective interpretation, to be attached to places that an outsider would look at and say, well, that's really not a very nice place. Why are you so tied to this? So I think that's actually a very good analogy.
Yes, Tim, please.
There's,
and after
Nikki and also Richard, there's an interesting narrative around here between the so-called freedom of movement of the agent and the way in which people are influenced and indeed manipulated by all kinds of forces, particularly associated with government and business. And there's a so-called structuration, but it's more than that. And though you touched on that, Nikki, and I thought you did a very good job of making sure that was part of your research design, I think for all of you, it's a relevant question that the so-called structuration, i.e. where you have what we call in the jargon third dimension power, where you actually believe that what you're doing is acting in something which is in your best interest, but in fact it's in the interest of people who want you to act that way. That in the area of sustainability transition, this is particularly pernicious. That's the big deal, and I want to get your reaction to that, Richard, because I think, and also Nikki, I think it's relevant to all of the research projects that there's so much that you have to disentangle to get towards sustainability, that any kind of movement in that way requires a huge amount of conscious reasoning, a large amount of support, what Domenico calls some attachment, some kind of sense of but purposeful commitment that you overcome a series of obstacles because you really do want to believe that that's the way you should go. Which is why, Dean and I raised the issue of a moral envelope, that we actually need some kind of moral position that says, this is right, come what may, even though I may have to fight to get to that point. And this raises the issue that we're working on in my part of the world, in Norfolk, what known as school-based entrepreneurs, eco-entrepreneurs, getting people between the age of 15 and 18 to become much more alive and aware to those types of so-called structuration forces, third dimension power forces. So they are moving into their own homes and also going into citizenship much more ready to battle on energy, on carbon, on food, on diet, and so on, and actually see the nature of the transition as something they should understand and lead and grasp, and be much more aware of the difficulties of trying to make that transition. So you've got that slight change, which I know you're into, of this awareness of the kinds of what you call resistant factors. So I just wondered whether the project, because of the peculiarities of sustainability transition, are really identifying this idea of some kind of dogged commitment that requires quite a special degree of, I think, moral backing than just simply, an economic or another form of pressure. It's more, and it's even more than leadership. It's actually something which comes right within the gut. It's visceral. And I'm just wondering whether you are thinking in those terms, in terms of you're looking at agent-based work.
Well, I think Nikki should take a shot at that.
I think I need a microphone also.
And
thanks, Rich.
Tony.
Sure.
Okay, well, it's not an easy question, no? First, yes, I I have to say, I believe we are in the midst of a transition, and it is an empirical choice to also look on ongoing phenomena, and that makes it really empirically and theoretically very interesting and very challenging. But what I have to say is we don't enter this naively. We don't only look on the success stories or the hallelujah stories or the rosy picture, that happy initiatives change the world and, a transition is happening. We really also look on the competition for funds, for attention, for time of members, of users, of supporters. We look on the tension between the people who are involved in these initiatives, especially when they gain this critical mass, with those who are excluded. What does it actually mean? Do we talk about eco-gentrification? And this is like a big question that, for example, the Stockholm partner is facing, with a lot of green, with a lot of sustainable initiatives in Stockholm. But then, is it really the high-income, white, well-off people who are there? Who are also these people who create this agency in this type of front-running cities? So, but we try to, for our sanity, we try to be balanced, to look on the hope, because we look on things changing, and we also choose, I have to say, the empirical grounds in a way to see where this change is amounting, that you cannot anymore ignore it. But at the same time, we know that there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of power plays in that. And we do get this complex picture to disentangle, but why not? If we don't do it, this is like also the new role that we have as scientists, to really go into the deep waters and try to disentangle that, and try to give an explanation and a transition while we are in it and part of it at the same time. Because what also Marco said, by us being there and bringing these initiatives together, we also create an empowerment ground for them. Mm-hmm. Them connecting and speaking to each other is already creating a new reality for them for the future. And in Dresden is very dominant, and in all the cities. So why to omit from the challenge? Yes, we believe we are in a transition, and we are also reflecting upon that, of what is actually transitioning, what is actually changing, and how far we go. And I like a lot the comment of Rich to look on the, I also wrote it down, the variability within context. And this is something that we see, but use this as an opportunity to investigate further, not just to shade away from the challenge. I can speak for 1 more hour, but so
I knew you could do it.
Now maybe you have to answer, no?
No, that's good.
Tony, can I?
Yeah, lots more hands.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I also like the comment. In fact, I've underlined it here, of the need to look at to understand variability within context. I think it's a very pertinent point. What I was wondering though is we seem to almost jump between issues of individual agency and collective agency here quite a lot. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the fact that many people can't exercise agency apart from via some form of proxy agency in a much more close to home kind of manner. Children, for example, or vulnerable people, sick people, or any one of us in some ways. So there's something about, I'll take intra-household dynamics for an example. There's something much closer to home than the collective idea of agency and agentic kind of action that I think maybe is being missed. I don't know if you would agree or not. I wonder if you got any reflections on that.
Yeah, no, I do agree, and I think I'll take what you said and give it even just a bit of a twist into something that I agree with even more, which is, I think, because it's core to what you said in terms of, for example, dynamics within the household, and we see this a lot in terms of people's engagement with environmental behaviors or environmental stewardship. Why aren't they doing more? Why aren't they doing this? And there's multiple mechanisms, right? And there's multiple ways of approaching these sorts of things. And teaching kids and raising kids from your standpoint to be, good citizens and good stewards is another. So there's also sort of direct and indirect, paths to the outcome. So it's not always sort of a simple, overt expression of a particular form of behavior, or the other way. So there are these other dynamics as well. And I do think, we need to see, to come back to your original point, agency is potentially scaled, right? I mean, so, and whether that's spatially scaled and sort of the close, I'm assuming you mean close to home, sort of more in a figurative sense rather than a strict spatial sense, but sort of different people are good at different things, right? There are people who are good at making the big soapbox speeches and getting other people to get involved in things, and then there are people who are much better at doing the smaller, closer to home types of things. And so, I mean, it's another source of variability, but I guess I would just underscore, it's another source of variability that I believe actually is at least reasonably systematic. I think some of it's predictable in terms of the kinds of, use, Margaret Archer has done some wonderful writing on reflexivity, and sort of she's created this sort of topology of people who are, she calls them the meta-reflexives. These are the big actors. These are the people who believe that they can get things done, have a vision for change of getting things done. And then there are these other types of reflexives in her parlance that still get things done, but not those big kind of things. So, yeah.
Alex Axelting.
Hi. This is a question aimed at asking about your research methodology.
Yeah.
When you talk about meaning, is the subjective meaning that people attach to the actions, is that something that always comes with a kind of a story? Or can it be more visceral? Can it be like a feeling almost?
Yeah, it can be, and I think there's a problem methodologically with getting at direct feelings. I mean, social scientists tend to not be very good at capturing emotion in a moment by moment, because we can't really do experiments with emotion. I mean, so often the best that we hope for is, you either wind up doing an experiment to see how people respond, which in some ways, lacks field validity, or, you wind up asking people to say, well, how did you feel? And maybe they get it right, and, maybe after the passage of time, they don't get it particularly right. So I think that's an important gap that we don't do very well. I mean, but in terms of sort of the cognitive descriptive element and even the symbolic element of meaning, I have asked questions about, how would you feel if these certain types of changes happened, with a different emotive scale. In terms of the, validity of that, I mean, as I said, reflecting on later, I mean, we see some effects that seem like they're reasonably interpretable effects, but we haven't cross-validated that with, actually forcing someone to move and seeing, what happens to their heart rate or their galvanic skin response or any of those other sorts of, indicators of, an emotional arousal kind of state. So it's a hard thing to capture.
Just reflecting on events in Europe in the last few weeks, it seems that opportunities for what you might call synchronized individual agency across large populations can happen when a kind of collective feeling emerges or synchronizes. So another kind of hunch is that could be an important part of the story of sustainability transitions. For
sure, and I think even the idea of whether things like attachment and meaning are individually held or socially constructed, right? It's easiest to measure individuals, right? You go up to them and you ask them questions and such. But social representations theory, for example, talks a lot about how these things are collectively determined, and it talks about the mechanisms for doing that. And so I think that unit of analysis question, which someone asked earlier about that with respect to agency and in particular, is pretty important to engage.
The social construction. Yeah.
Tina says,
yes. Well, yeah, I think we reached the finish, the end of the meeting. So, as Helen has said in the previous talk, this is becoming hotter and hotter, no? And it has to be in this way, no? Because the people who is meeting here is not only giving presentations, but also we will try to produce some dissemination products and some didactic material, no? Because this is our responsibility, as I said at the introduction. A responsibility that tries to give an answer to the investment of the European Commission, because if we do an account of the investment here in the projects that are represented here, we show more than 37 million euros. So, well, it's a good amount that put more warm, no, in this pressure cooker, no, in addition to the scientific and relevant aspects, no, that are being discussed here. So, well, thank you, Richard, for having accepted to be here with us and for providing these views, no, from your own research. And now, well, it's going to the hotel and later to the restaurant in the Artabria restaurant. It's a local restaurant very well known for the traditional food, no, here from Galicia, from Coruña. So have a happy moment now until the moment of the rest. No?